All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining today to our second webinar session as part of Kids Brain Health Network's implementation community. So very, very fortunate to be the facilitator for this community. My name is Vanessa. And as part of my role, I'm also a postdoctoral researcher with CanChild and two developmental services organizations, Children's Treatment Network in Ontario and the Rehabilitation Centre for Children in Manitoba. So today is our second webinar session, and we're, like I said, very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Stephanie Brooks, who will have a fantastic presentation today for us related to where do communities of practice fit in learning health systems. So I'm sure there'll be lots of great discussion around both learning health systems, communities of practice, this also being a community of practice, and then thinking about that synergy between them. So very exciting discussion that we have today, and really looking forward to it. And thank you everyone for taking the time to be here today and joining today's session. And that, as always, thank you to Kids Brain Health Network for the support of this growing community. So as I mentioned, my name is Vanessa. I am a settler with Portuguese ancestry and the daughter of two immigrant parents who came from Portugal to these lands when they were in their teenage years. As I mentioned, my primary role is a postdoctoral researcher at CanChild, which is housed at McMaster University. This is located in the city we now call Hamilton in the province of Ontario. And that is the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee Nations, Treaty 3 territory, and protected under the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. I am very grateful to be able to learn, to grow, to connect with so many people on that land, but also across our country and these lands at a national scope. So we also like to acknowledge and want to recognize that because KBHN is national in scope and reach, we give gratitude to the many lands and acknowledge the traditional territories our network works and connects. So if you're comfortable sharing, I know there's lots of people on the call today, but if there's anything you'd like to share about yourself in the chat, or if you'd like to share a little bit of a reflection about where you are located and your locationality, we'd greatly appreciate that too. So quickly, just a little bit about our KBHN implementation community that we've been growing and building and changing and adapting over the past year. And it's been very exciting to be part of that in partnership with Corey and Kim and so many of you on the call today. So our implementation community, and sorry if you see my mouse, I'm just letting people into the room as we're talking. But it includes two main components, our webinar sessions like we have today, and then smaller community group chats. So these are kind of our smaller, closed isn't the right word, but smaller group with people who are affiliated primarily with KBHN projects. And our community serves many purposes. And again, we're still co-building this. This is likely to shift as our community grows and changes. But one of the main things is really to build capacity and support in the KBHN community, but also more broadly in implementation science and practice initiatives, with the ultimate goal of advancing implementation science in the field of neurodevelopmental disability research. Part of this community is discussing and learning about complex, topical, and KBHN relevant implementation topics. And that's typically what has formed the topic selection for our webinar sessions, which we have more coming in the fall as well, which we'll be excited to share. Additionally, through these webinars, we are able to build a broader neurodevelopmental disability research community, but also more broadly around child health development, other related research fields that people are coming from and experiences, and broader network sharing, connecting, and co-learning. So again, a newer initiative coming through KBHN, but we're really excited to see the work that's coming out of it, the community that we're building, and the learning and knowledge that we're sharing together. If you want to see more, the wonderful Gail, who is on the call, I believe, too, created a beautiful webpage for our implementation community on the KBHN website. You can check it out there through the QR code, and I can also pop the link in the chat afterwards. As always, just some quick housekeeping. Please share your questions in the chat during our question period at the end. Either chat, unmute, whatever you're comfortable with. There also might be opportunity for questions and discussion during Dr. Brooks's presentation, so we can also approach it that way too, whatever everyone is comfortable, and we'll follow your lead, Stephanie. So, and then again, with cameras, if you are comfortable, we'd love to see your faces, but there is obviously no pressure, and we know things in life happen, and sometimes people are joining from different locations, so we just appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. So the objectives of today's session are to, 1, clarify the concept of learning health systems. 2, to differentiate the various potential roles of communities of practice in learning health systems. And 3, to give recommendations on how to optimize communities of practice. So we're really excited to hear from you, Stephanie, and a lot of the work that you've done in this space. And so I will pass it on to you. I just want to quickly highlight that at the end of the session, we would really appreciate your feedback on these webinar sessions. And then we'll share that back with Stephanie, and that will also help to shape our future sessions moving forward. So feel free to scan the code. I'll also put the survey link in the chat now and at the end of the session so that people can do that when they have a chance. All right, I'll stop talking and pass it to the star of the show today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for such a kind introduction, Vanessa. So I'll get right to it. I'm so excited to be speaking to you all, such an aligned group with this research. So my name is Stephanie Brooks, and I am really excited to be here talking about all things learning health systems and communities of practice. This was part of my doctoral research, and yeah, to Vanessa's point about popping up with questions or waiting until the end, I can't see the chat. So if you have questions, please just come off mute and interrupt me. Don't feel like it's an actual interruption. I invite that. So anytime something pops up, please speak up. So I'd like to do a quick land acknowledgement to honor where this research was conducted. So I live and work here near the University of Alberta in this picture, which is on Treaty 6 territory, the homeland of many Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Niitsitapi, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, and Inuit. These lands offer incredible mountains, plains, river valleys, such as this one on the Saskatchewan River, as well as urban centers, all of which offer important opportunities in the spirit of reconciliation for collaborations that can help achieve equity in the health and well-being of people living across Alberta. So when I conducted this research, I did so because I was being left empty-handed for evidence while working at the Alberta Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research Support Unit, also known as ABS4U. So ABS4U is a research and knowledge translation intermediary established to support patient-oriented research and then subsequent implementation. They build partnerships and support services to bridge the gap between evidence and practice, especially to strengthen Alberta's learning health system. The really special thing about ABS4U is that it has the mandate to help the health system in any way the health system needs. The other special thing, and this is the case with all of the provincial SPORE units, is that we're mandated to help build and strengthen learning health systems. In Alberta, we were pretty privileged when we received this mandate because Alberta was already making big investments and widespread change to transform its provincial health system into a learning health system. One area that they did want support with, though, while they were doing this transformation was around knowledge translation and bringing knowledge translators together and learning from one another. And this had been a common thing that we were hearing from people across the province, from academics to practice-based folks. And so ABS4U launched the KT Alberta Community of Practice. And this was to help connect folks and build knowledge translation capacity across the province. Now, I'm going to be completely honest with you, it did not go well. I was tasked as the manager, and I just couldn't seem to create any momentum or engagement through this community of practice. So I got the green light to interview other communities of practice to learn from them, and we decided to make this a proper research study. So this is all happening in the context of learning health systems, and I know that your community of practice is interested in this concept. So I'm going to give a good chunk of time up front here, diving into the ideas of what learning health systems are, and then we'll take a break to talk about learning health systems, and then I'll come back and present the actual research about where do communities of practice fit. So learning health systems really come from a historical trajectory of health systems wanting to be of the highest value, at the same time that academia was looking to increase its relevance and impact in society. So historically, we've really thought of healthcare delivery and academia as two separate and distinct enterprises, but we now know that treating them this way creates unacceptable delays in care being available to patients. So in the last couple of decades, we've moved towards a more knowledge translation and exchange approach where brokers help to promote new evidence to health promotion and health delivery organizations. The learning health system model is really a natural extension of the knowledge translation and exchange model, now embedding research into practice to really accelerate the creation and uptake of evidence. So learning health systems have all sorts of definitions, but the most fundamental and the cleanest one that I've seen is that these are systems that have the adequate capacity to generate and use knowledge that they need to be effective. Notice that this definition doesn't have anything to do with specifics around data, location, priorities. And this is really because I think that learning health systems are far more flexible than they're often presented. When really a learning health system can be as focused or as broad as the system needs it to be, as long as it's set up to generate actionable knowledge, it can be a learning health system. As long as the system can be set up to learn from itself and then use those lessons learned to improve, it's a learning health system. But investments in learning activities tend to account for a remarkably low proportion of the overall investments made in health programming and delivery. Learning activities historically have not really found their place in budgets, especially not compared to other health system priorities. And some suspect that this neglect comes from the idea that other operational activities are simply more urgent, and the benefits of learning are less concrete and tangible. You really have to believe in it before you can see it. So one of the contributing factors to the relative neglect of learning could be that the conceptualization and framing of learning health systems and their potential benefits are really vague. If you've tried to look into this literature before, you'll know what I mean. So let's try to bring some clarity to this concept. So learning health systems, I do find, are really difficult to describe simply because they match the vision that people have of how health systems already work. People think that healthcare should be of high value, create good experiences for patients and providers, ensure positive health outcomes, and be equitably accessible to all. But in reality, like everybody that works in this space knows that these are the goals of health systems, all health systems, not just learning health systems, because healthcare is messy. We have to advocate for ourselves as patients. Care providers aren't adequately protected from abuse and they have no work-life balance. We all hope that patients will leave the health interactions with good health outcomes, but we really don't know what's going to happen. And the idea of healthcare being equitable, like we all know that there's work to do around this, right? So the real problem that learning health systems are trying to solve is the glacial pace of adoption of high quality evidence, because this gap causes substantial delays in people gaining any benefit from healthcare, let alone accessing the highest quality, most advanced healthcare possible. And this is also a challenge because when new healthcare does enter the system, it's often ad hoc. It's not taken up systematically. So some benefit before others, or some may benefit while others never will. To pile onto all of this, patient and caregiver and community voices are often excluded from these high-level healthcare decisions around improvements. So learning health systems are really aiming to embed research into everyday practice to create and implement evidence towards all of these goals without delay. So learning health systems are complex themselves because they're set up in complex systems. Health systems are complex. Because of this, there's lots of moving parts, and some ways of conceptualizing learning health systems resonate with some people, and other ways resonate with other people. So I'm going to go through these three different models to give you a rundown of learning health systems from different perspectives, with hopes that something will stick for each of you. So I'm going to talk first about this far left model, which is a conceptual model. I will then talk about this middle model, which is a model that was built from a clinical perspective, and then this one on the far right, which was built from a social sciences perspective. They all have their strengths, but they're all quite different, so it can be a lot. So like I said, if questions arise and you want to pipe up before hearing more, please feel free to do so. Don't feel like you're interrupting me. So the first model that I would like to show you is because I find it really useful for conceptualizing the potential infrastructure that you can tap into for learning health systems work. This one really focuses on the idea that there's ideal health outcomes. These are the five goals that I just showed you. To get to these goals, the model found that you need a cyclical learning cycle where you use practice-based data to answer a research question. You format your knowledge for decision-making, and then those decisions are put into practice in terms of change, and then those change are followed and optimized in this cyclical way. And the model also says that you need all of these different pillars, which are also referred to as infrastructures, in order to be able to do this learning. I want to give a couple of examples of each of these pillars because conceptually this is quite vague. I'll have to resist making this into a Bubba Gump moment because there's so many kind of ways that this can show up, but I'll give one or two examples of each. So the social pillar is really the actors and networks that interact with the learning health systems. So communities of practice have been noted to belong into this pillar. There's also like the SPORE units would be an example of this. The scientific pillar is any program or resource that helps with knowledge generation and use. The technological pillar, often what will be referred to as electronic health records, but you'll see through this presentation that they're not necessary for learning health systems. It's just kind of one opportunity if you're going to have a technology-based way of doing your work. And then policy, legal, and ethical, those are all different frameworks and guidance documents to help us do this type of learning in a good, ethical, legal way. This framework remains quite conceptual and vague, so I found a way to absorb this information a little bit more easily and to show just how important infrastructure is to learning health systems, because that really is the argument of this model. So I like to think of learning health systems the way that we think of households. In doing so, we can see how learning health systems, just how reliant they are on infrastructure, and the way that cyclical learning is inherent to learning health systems. So first of all, learning health systems are underpinned by core values. This model was built in a Canadian context, so a lot of these will resonate with us. They include things like adaptability, equity, inclusiveness, privacy, scientific integrity, accountability, solidarity, and transparency. Those pillars or the infrastructure that was described are like the walls, electricity, water, and the roof of a house. We need all of these in place to focus on how to complete our household work. We can't just do with one or two of the infrastructures. Otherwise, we're spending all of our time in less efficient ways, working towards survival rather than planning and thinking towards the future and creating a broader impact. Now, as I said earlier, people who want to create learning cycles in their health organizations don't need to have every possible infrastructure. There's need to haves and nice to haves. In this example, you know, we need shelter, food, heat. We don't need butcher block countertops and heated towel racks, right? So there are things that are nice to have, but in learning health systems, I think a big part of the work is figuring out like, what do we need to start and then going from there. Once we have that need to have infrastructure in place and everyone inside the house, we can collaborate to figure out what we need now and in the future to sort out our routines and processes to make sure that everyone is taken care of. So in a household, this may be about juggling schedules and organizing drivers and things like that so that we can all get to our activities and our appointments and things like that. In learning health systems, this is about taking an evidence-based approach to our questions around improvement, documenting and measuring everything that we do and rapidly learning from our work about what works and what doesn't and making changes so that we can optimize our work. And over time, we're cooking, and that's what this chimney represents. It's showing everything that's coming from the work inside. So in a household, this will be the smells of dinner, hopefully some laughter and some nurturing. In health systems, work to improve. This chimney will show the work that's being done to improve patient outcomes and experiences, to improve workplace satisfaction, and to do so with better value than conventional health systems can. So I hope that clarifies some of these concepts in terms of the values and pillars, the learning processes, and the outcomes. In this next model, it depicts learning health systems as an engine with fuel and gears and brakes that all work together to get us towards that ideal state of healthcare delivery. So where systems improve individual and population health, but most important, that these systems make improvements through rigorous methods of discovery and leading directly to implementation of what is discovered. This means that the system learns from itself and immediately implements those lessons. In the middle of the model, here is where the learning happens, which is represented by gears. These gears are the various types of research evidence and methods that are central to learning in health systems. So these brightly colored gears are things like the methods and the data used to inform change. So this is things like evidence synthesis from internal and external evidence, population health data, direct engagement with patients and intervention users, ongoing monitoring and evaluation, and of course, implementation and implementation science. And then the dark blue gears are the sectors within which we work. And when you look at it, it covers the whole spectrum of care from social determinants of health through to targeted specialty care. So the difference here from that first model is really that the first model is very conceptual, just kind of talking about the structures that you need in place, where this starts to talk about like what actual data do we need and which health sectors can be involved in learning health systems. At the top of this model is the fuel for the health systems. So this includes individuals, partnerships, resources that are needed for the learning health system engine to operate smoothly and sustainably. And this is about creating an enabling context where people can be able and safe to experiment. At the bottom of the model are the brakes or the moderators. And I really like this model because instead of talking about barriers, it talks about brakes and modifiers because these are naturally occurring things that we must bump up against. So it's more of a reality-based model where we recognize that things restrict learning, and much of it has to do with research and capacity, as well as organizational goals. So systems have to build their capacity and culture of change. The priorities of the system also need to align to make it safe for experimentation. And priorities also need to be really clear for researchers so that they can focus their work and that their research follows legal and ethical rules and regulations. So you can see some overlap between the two models, but they really start to focus on different things. The last model that I would like to show you is underpinned by social science. This was developed by the Alliance for Health Policy and Systems, and this model has an absolutely stellar free training available online. It takes about 3 to 8 hours, depending on how deeply you want to engage with the material, but it's really good. And there are lots of health system examples to show what learning health systems can look like. And this was also developed for the first two models were developed in a Western context. This one was developed to support lower middle income countries. So it's just a very different perspective that I find really helpful because the model focuses on various types of learning that can happen. Specifically, it shows that learning can happen at different levels, that there's distinct types of learning that are described as learning loops, and that there's different means of learning. So I'll go through each of these, starting with this orange section, which is about how learning can happen at different levels. So Learning can happen at the individual, group, organization, or cross-organization level. And at each of these levels, it's people who learn, either as individuals or as groups of various sizes. And I think this is really something that's missing from the other models, is the focus on like, what does the people work look like rather than how is the system set up? So I find being able to look at all of these models really helpful. And I'll bring this back to communities of practice as well. So people at the individual level learn, these are folks that are learning that include like individual health workers, professionals and managers, members of the public or community, service users, researchers, analysts, educators. In general, learning at the individual level entails information gathering from different sources, gaining tacit knowledge through experience, and interpreting these different knowledges individually. When we look at how learning happens at the group level, this includes things like community groups, management teams, teams of health workers, research teams, even like units, sanitary inspectors, educators. This learning tends to involve the collective interpretation of knowledge through dialogue and exchange, and the development of shared understanding of issues, problems, or solutions. So it's less about sense making on your own, but sense making with a group. And then organizational level learning could include primary care clinics, a hospital, a region or territory, the Ministry of Health, NGOs, like any of these larger organizations. And then cross-organization, as it sounds, is learning between these different organizations, either within a provincial context or national district system level, all sorts of sectors and geographies. So continuous learning at the individual and team levels is necessary. However, it's not enough to influence the broader changes at the organization and cross-organizational level. That's why they distinguish between these four. Learning at the organizational and cross-organization is about coordinating actions and integrating them to become routine. And this takes place through the formalization of rules and procedures that are conducive to learning. So ultimately here, learning is about integrating and institutionalizing so that knowledge can be shared and used on a regular basis and can be moved beyond the system which it was created. Every system is going to want to learn different things, and those learning priorities will change over time. But all learning can be viewed as cyclical, where information is collected to create knowledge, and then that knowledge is used for action and change. So this model still uses that idea of iterative learning. But this model actually spells out the type of learning that can happen, and it is coined single, double, or triple looped learning here in blue. So I'll go through each of these. Single loop learning supports changes in everyday care by adapting normal routines and practices, things that already exist. But this type of learning doesn't question the underlying assumptions that underpin existing programs, policies, or processes. So this is most closely aligned to conventional quality improvement. And I like to think of this one as, are we doing things right? Are we doing things right is the type of question that would underpin single loop learning. Double loop learning is more, are we doing the right things? It goes further to ask questions of the frameworks, models, and assumptions around problems and their solutions. So this type of learning is meant to drive us to have a deeper understanding of why health outcomes are the way that they are, and to alter our goals and policies and approaches to move ourselves towards that ideal state of learning health systems. So building better care delivery models that improve equitable access would fall into this type of double loop learning. Triple loop learning is often referred to as learning how to learn, or are we learning in the right ways? So it challenges fundamental assumptions and improves the way in which systems learn from themselves. This type of learning will help you build that learning infrastructure and to build partnerships to move more efficiently and effectively through learning over time. And then finally, we'll move to the red area of the model, which shows that there's different means of learning. Learning in complex systems such as healthcare occurs through distinct but interconnected means. And these are broadly identified as learning through information, learning through deliberation, or learning through action and practice. So this part of the model is kind of busy with all of these arrows. But the rundown is that learning through information includes collecting and processing information, as well as taking steps for disseminating that information more broadly. Common sources would include routine health information, primary and secondary research, organizational documentation, and community feedback. And then the information can be used to inform routine or strategic decisions. It can be used for training and capacity building and for dissemination. Learning through deliberation is, we've touched on already a little bit, is essential for linking past action to future goals. So it can contextualize problems and supports collective understanding of solutions. So examples of this would be deliberative activities that include different interest holders like community decision makers and frontline staff. Patient-oriented research would be an example of deliberative type learning. And this type of learning is generated through processes that are really about developing collective knowledge and insights. And then finally, learning through action occurs when people learn through practice and repetition of tasks or skills. Such learning often generates innovations and good practices that can be shared with other actors beyond the health system. Okay, so that's my rundown of learning health systems. Let's pause for a second and I can answer any questions that may have come up about learning health systems specifically.
Do you have a favorite?
Do I have a favorite? So I find the social science model is really helpful for thinking about like, what do we want to learn and how can we learn it? So I really love this one. And I do love the training. I think it really helps to solidify that. So if anybody's curious about learning health systems, like definitely check it out. And then the engine and gears, I also like just because it's more detailed and it talks about data sources other than just electronic health records, which I think is important. So yeah, the reason that I showed all three is because they both have their strengths. I wouldn't say choose one or the other, but being able to think about the three together was super helpful for me and I think can be helpful for others as well. Somebody asked, can you share the link to the outline module for this model? Oh, you've already found it. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Andrea, I see your hand up.
Yeah, this was really helpful. Thank you, Stephanie. I'm not as familiar with the learning health systems, theories, models, and frameworks, but very much so in the implementation science frameworks. And one that kind of I see some synergies with is the interactive systems framework, which is really trying to do the same type of thing and bring us together and not have these two separate communities. Have you seen any literature that has, compared these or looked at some of the implementation models and frameworks in comparison with the learning health systems?
That's a good question. I don't think that I've really seen, there's definitely, I'm having like three different thoughts at once. Okay, so first of all, there was a recent uh, systematic review or scoping review, and I can find the links to these and I'll get Vanessa to send them out with the rest of the information. But it was fascinating. It synthesized all of the knowledge around learning health systems, all the frameworks that have been used for learning health systems so far. And they found that like half of the ones that followed an established framework or cited an established framework came from implementation science, which I found really interesting. So I think that there's two things that could be going on. Either learning health system thinkers could be seeing the potential for implementation science in learning health systems, which you see come up pretty frequently, but it's not really dove into very often. People just say implementation is an obvious part of these types of systems. But I have to wonder, because implementation scientists are so theory model framework focused, is it them that are writing these articles arguing for themselves and trying to promote their role in learning health systems? So I don't know which one it is. But the interesting thing is that there's lots of arguments. I found articles that argue how implementation science can strengthen learning health systems, but there's not any that I can think of off the top of my head where they directly compare implementation science frameworks with learning health system frameworks. And I think that that would be a very interesting approach. Because like you saw from these 3 frameworks, and these are like really popular frameworks, there is things missing in terms of that detail. Like the implementation systems framework is so great for saying who exactly is involved in these different things. There's nothing like that for learning health systems. And I think it's because it's so complex that it can become a little overwhelming. But I think it would be a really interesting study to do that. But I can share the scoping review because it is interesting and it gives you a rundown of like who's theorized what in learning health systems in different ways.
Yeah.
Vanessa?
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. And that was so helpful to see the breakdown of those 3 models. And yeah, if we could definitely get the links to those, and I can share that with all the attendees today, that would be super helpful. You explained that so clearly. I feel like learning health systems has been this like big, complex, scary topic. It definitely still is, but you've helped to kind of break down some of those elements through those different models. So I really appreciate that. I have a question more about thinking about the role of academia or researchers within learning health systems. And in your experience, for these roles, obviously, you talked I like the framing of, practice-based data and collecting some of that knowledge and information. Are you seeing typically that type of work being done by roles within the organization, whether that's like the healthcare organization, whether that's, specific researchers or evaluators who are embedded and work in the organizations? How do you see that connection with academic institutions and academia? Like, I'm just thinking of things, we have our REB is in place for a reason, obviously, and I'm not saying ethics is obviously very important, but we know those processes can take a long time. We have grant timelines. So like a lot of things that I'm sure would also impact the pace in which learning health system activities can continue to move forward. So I'm just curious about any thoughts around that, the role of academic institutions, how researchers and where they fit within learning health systems and the different roles there, and how as academics can be better at bridging those gaps to support this.
Yeah, totally. This is such a big topic in learning health systems. And this is where the small amount of funding for learning in learning health systems, where the rubber really hits the road there is like people want to learn, but they don't want to invest in it. It is expensive. It requires high level training. So I think that academics right now, until health systems are, and we have seen some examples of really successful learning initiatives within health systems, I think in the ideal state, the embedded researchers would be lived and salaried and housed within the systems that they work in. So Veterans Affairs has an amazing setup like this, but there's such a different type of organization that has a different type of funding and mandate than others. But it is possible. But in a lot of Canadian contexts, it's not. So they're going to rely on partnership with academia. And so and a big thing that I hear over and over is that, just the priorities and the timelines are misaligned. It makes doing these types of partnerships quite difficult. So one way that I've seen this overcome is just through like long-standing partnerships, researchers that really commit to being applied researchers, and they develop partnerships with people and specifically with like unit level folks, because decision makers, there's often a lot of turnover because of political things and stuff that goes on. So if you can build relationships with like certain units that are more stable, you can get a lot of buy-in and good work there. And then you can have, with like REBs, you can have the ethics application at the very beginning, and it can kind of just evolve over time. It doesn't have to take up time every time you're asking, adding a new kind of question or moving on to a different phase of implementation, things like that. I've also seen people like Carol Estabrooks at the University of Alberta has a really interesting model where she works in long-term care facilities. So they don't have any of this kind of stuff set up. They're like private organizations. And so through her grant, she has said, we can organize these types of things. This is how it will improve everybody. I'll fund it. You don't have to worry about it, but you have to let us, be involved in your work. And that has worked out great in terms of being a multi-site learning health system. So it doesn't have to be in one hospital either. It can be like different sites doing the same type of work that could count as a learning health system. So there's lots of different ways, but I think that academics do have to be committed to being applied researchers, working for the system rather than working on their own kind of curiosities and interests necessarily. Of course, those can overlap ideally. And then I think the move towards more practical research methods is very helpful, because that's a thing, is like just the amount of rigor and the time that it takes can just not align with the speed that health systems need their information by. So yeah, being able to do rapid synthesis, rapid research methods, these types of things really help as well. Does that answer your question, Vanessa?
Perfectly. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Michelle?
This, I think, builds from what you were just saying, because I was interested in your house analogy and the things that are must have versus the icing on the cake things. Because if you're working with systems and structures that don't have a lot of resource to put towards infrastructure and other things. So I appreciated your points about flexibility and some of what's published. I'm like, well, that's not feasible. So I'm wondering, what are the parts that are necessary to be a learning health system from your perspective, that we should be considering?
I think the most fundamental thing is the how would you put it? It's giving people within the health system paid time to contribute to these learning activities, because it's all going to be collaborative. And often I've heard that the health system's supportive, but they don't give funds or priority. So how are people able, like, so now they're just volunteering to be involved in research that's supposed to support the organization, right? So I think that having, at minimum, paid time for people to contribute, and then the researchers can take on more of that infrastructure piece through their grant funding is more feasible. I think a lot what you'll see in the literature is around electronic health records and like really sweeping, like they're like your whole province or your whole country has to be on the same system, which is like, it's of course ideal and people are like trying to work towards it, but that's like 30 years away. So in the meantime, figuring out, I do think it has to be data driven, like what access to what data do you have, and then building reasonable questions from there. Because I think people often build from the question first and then bump into barriers around data and collaboration later on. So I think there's more strategy like that you can do, where it's not necessarily that you need to have XYZ facilities or resources in place, but like what do we have and what can we work with, and then being creative from that perspective first. Does that help? All right. Anyone else? Okay, I'll get into communities of practice then, and where they fit within here. So I'll share my screen again. Okay, so with communities of practice, you have a good grasp now on learning health systems, and we can talk about where communities of practice fit within these bigger systems. Communities of practice, as we all know, people who are interested in them, are an incredibly common approach to learning and applying new skills in health systems, not just learning health systems. However, there is so little concrete evidence about how to set up and manage communities of practice, both for member success and for organizational success. Like, communities of practice are shockingly unevidence-based, considering how popular they are. And so when my community of practice was failing and I couldn't find evidence to course correct, I saw the opportunity to build some evidence to help other people like myself. And one thing that I learned in this study is there's lots of people like myself who've like tried, still believe in it, are trying other ways, but there's a lot of trial and error going on when it comes to learning health, or when it comes to communities of practice. So this is published. I do encourage you to check out the full paper, but I'll give you the rundown. So my research question was, how can facilitators design and manage communities of practice to optimize their contribution to learning health systems? But I do think that the results here apply to any community of practice. I don't think it needs to be in learning health systems. I used collective case study methodology to guide this research. The study used semi-structured group and individual interviews. We transcribed the interviews verbatim and organized the data in vivo. All participants received a summary of their interview and were invited to comment on the interpretation of what they said. And we held interviews until we reached saturation. We coded the interviews using directed content analysis, where you code deductively using an established theory model or framework, but you leave space to code anything inductively that doesn't fit. So it's a really nice method for doing some theory building. I coded the transcripts and analyzed them myself, and then another researcher acted as a critical friend, and they reviewed all of my work to point out gaps or places to reconsider my interpretation. And this study was guided by the conceptual framework for value creating learning health systems, this first model that I showed you. And I used this model because at the time it was the first and only Canadian developed learning health system framework. I think it would be interesting to redo this study and map it to the other frameworks that I showed you, but this is the one that we used for now. We conducted 21 interviews with participants representing 16 communities of practice and 5 community of practice facilitation platforms. These facilitation platforms were offices that oversaw the operations of numerous communities of practice. So they were kind of like admin operations support. All participants were Canadian-based, and each community of practice was specifically dedicated to knowledge mobilization in some sort. The communities of practice ranged in membership from under 100 to over 1,000, and the facilitation platforms at the time of the interviews were overseeing between 3 and 26 communities of practice at the time. The communities of practice were between 3 and 4 years old on average. The platforms were a little older; they were 6 to 7 years old. And most often the communities of practice had an interprofessional membership, but sometimes it was homogenous membership and sometimes it was interdisciplinary. Most often though, it was people with different jobs working around the same problem or the same solution who made up the communities of practice that we interviewed. There was a lot of variation on the resources available to run the communities of practice and the facilitation platforms. For example, most communities of practice were volunteer run. Some were running without any funding at all, while all of the facilitation platforms had more consistent funding and were mostly reliant on paid staff. Evaluation in both spaces was fairly weak, which would give some explanation as to why we don't have much evidence underpinning communities of practice. And this is a catch-22 because if communities of practice are often unfunded and volunteer run, of course, evaluation is not going to be the priority. So there's some thinking in communities of practice around how to ensure that evaluation is possible. We found that communities of practice fell into one of these 4 models, but the models are not clear-cut. There's a lot of diversity within each model in terms of the communities of practice main purpose, how they chose to engage, the benefits or contributions they were aiming to make, and the target of their membership. So we really grouped the different communities of practice into what they were really built to do. So some were around mobilizing knowledge. So really trying to put evidence into practice. Some were simply around knowledge sharing. Some was mandatory. So it would be like a new program or policy or intervention was being implemented. And you had to join a community of practice to ensure that the implementation in your space was going well. And if it wasn't, the community of practice was there to help you correct different things. It was also meant to share wins. So if one unit was doing really well, others could learn about what was going on there. So that kind of model. And then there was one that was really about interdisciplinary collaboration. And these were things like researchers and practitioners coming together, or people trying to learn from different sectors, prevention and treatment, working together, things like that. It's hard for me to go into detail about this in slides. But I do think that this is one of the most important contributions of this study, because it ends up in the publication being this huge long table of all these different purposes, engagement methods, members contribution and benefits and the target membership, I'll show you. Because let me see if are you seeing the table right now? Yeah, okay. So yes, it ends up being a big long table, but it's a landscape of things to give people a starting place for their thinking. They don't have to just sit down and be like, I want to make a community of practice for kids' brain health. Now they can say, well, what could the specific purpose be? And they can kind of look through all of these different ones. We ended up categorizing them because we could, but I think that you could really look at this table just generally and say, like, what are my engagement method options? Going back to the question after the LHS slides around, like, where do we start? You can see, like, what do we have to work with? What engagement can we do? Who is our target membership? And then you can start kind of mapping out your own community of practice there. So there's all sorts of different options here that the different communities of practice that we interviewed came up with. So I just think that this is a really nice table that's worth going into the publication to look at. Okay, and because the other main finding from this study, in my opinion, is that there's a really common belief that communities of practice are spontaneous, and I do believe that they can be, but they can also be built with very clear intentionality. And I think that that intention will help optimize communities of practice with ease, instead of having to deal with the growing pains and the frustration and the costs that come with trial and error. So this paper is really meant to help people build communities of practice with more of that intentionality. And that's really why I wanted to map communities of practice to learning health systems, to learn, like, what areas and what type of work can communities of practice do to strengthen the overall system. And so here's what I found in that mapping. Communities of practice can advance learning across the iterative learning cycle. They can help identify areas to ask research questions. They can help collect data. They can format data. They have people in communities of practice in a health system will have ideas of how to make research actionable and to move their leadership to make different decisions. They can also help with the planning and implementation and evaluation of those changes, and then follow how the change goes. They also make up the social and scientific infrastructure based on their membership. So if a community of practice is primarily practice-based folks, they would fall into the social learning health system pillar. If they're made up of researchers, they would also account for some of the scientific infrastructure that would be available. Like this community of practice, this is a really nice quote in which one of the communities of practice was expressly trying to facilitate conversations between practitioners and researchers so that relevant evidence could be created for immediate implementation. So this community of practice in and of itself was really following a learning health system kind of learning approach. Communities of practice facilitation platforms not only reduce staff member workload because they take all the kind of administration and operational stuff that can exhaust volunteers or unpaid staff off of the community members' plates. But from a learning health system perspective, the big contribution is that the facilitation platforms can perform this connecting and aligning function. They can help coordinate critical activities like priority alignment, knowledge brokerage, and sharing across the system. And in this example, which is so good, it shows how a facilitation platform can help with external and internal priority alignment. Furthermore, these facilitation platforms, when there's overseeing so many communities of practice, they can say, oh, this community over here is working on this. This one's working on this. Maybe we should get them together for a couple of sessions because they would both benefit from each other's insights. So it's a really powerful way of coordinating and accelerating work, avoiding duplication, which everybody's always worried about. And I truly believe that if an organization is going to have numerous communities of practice, that these facilitation platforms are brilliant investments for the efficiencies of the community of practice, but also in how they can maximize impact. So from this study, the big takeaways was, this study came from trying to address practical facilitation topics in an area that had limited evidence. This was the first study to identify the roles and characteristics of communities of practice and to highlight how communities of practice can accelerate best practices in healthcare delivery. The study also uncovered the potential of investing in community of practice facilitation platforms, which I really do think is one of the highlights of this study. So these are the references that include the references to the different models that I showed up front. So you'll have access to that. And I'll leave it there and we can have the rest of this time for some chatting.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was a fantastic presentation. As our own community of practice here as well, that was very relevant and informative. And I love that table showing the different engagement strategies, pulling together those different ideas. I think that is such an important contribution to the literature and just the field and people approaching communities of practice in general. And it's funny, you bring up the lack of literature information, because I know when we were, again, forming this, creating a bit of a proposal, having some of those ideas around what this would look like, I had a hard time finding examples, concrete examples, more, broad, like what is the domain, the community, the shared practice, like those more theoretical pieces of it. So I love that. So just thank you. And I really liked also the connection to the learning health systems. I can start off the questions and then open it up to the group. Around the communities of practice piece, what was one of the most surprising things that came out of that work, or something that you weren't expecting that, again, shows that value towards how communities of practices can be structured, or yeah.
Yeah, I think the most surprising thing to me was around the bigger role that the facilitation platforms can play. I didn't really even know that these were things. They just kind of, people, when we were interviewing the individual communities of practice, they were saying, we have a broader facilitator that you should meet. And that's how we got connected with these folks. And they were doing just truly amazing work in terms of support that I wish I had had as a community of practice facilitator, because they would do things like give anybody who wants to run a community of practice, they could give them a really clear heads up of like, this is what it means. This is the work that's involved. This is what we can do. And this is what you'll need to do to make this work. So I loved that kind of training and development element that they can perform. They were also really good about saying, like, we can do the reporting and the evaluation, and we can use standard frameworks for evaluating different communities of practice, and based on organizational goals, like whatever the organization is giving the funding to these communities of practice for, we can do that mapping and reporting back and da 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 da. So they take all of the like really the work that people begrudge doing off their plate, and then they can just get on with learning, which is the fun stuff, right? So it was, I think that the facilitation platforms was my biggest lesson. It's a tricky one because you're trying to tell health systems or institutions to find money for something new, which they never like to hear. But I do think that it's a valuable thing to consider. And even in academic institutions, I think that we lean on communities of practice a lot too. And if we had support like that, it would just open up space for more learning, better sharing of lessons across the space, that kind of thing.
Amazing.
Thank you for all, these are all very nice comments I'm seeing in the chat. I just want to say thanks to everybody for these.
So yeah, amazing presentation. And sorry, just wanting to pick up off of a comment you just said there around evaluating and frameworks to do that. And apologies if I missed that. Are there frameworks that these communities of practice have used? I know I've seen one like Kirkpatrick's, not specific to communities of practice, but more training and knowledge in that piece. I'm wondering if you've seen anything around that.
Yeah, that's a good question. No, nobody in the study brought up, they brought up doing like background literature searches like you and I have done. But they bumped up with the same thing where they were just like, the kind of most concrete piece of advice that I found was to just start, just go ahead, and things will happen the way that they naturally happen. And I think that that is a really old school thing that you'll see. Like if you go back, like the further back you go, the more common you'll see that communities of practice are spontaneous and they're self-organizing and all of this stuff. And I do think that they can be, but if over time I see more and more people saying like you can do this intentionally. And that's what I was trying to do. And there was just so little evidence about how to do that. And I do think that that's a big one. So the evaluation piece, they were interesting when they weren't using evaluation frameworks. If anything, they would say like, oh, we have like evaluation forms, like feedback forms at the end of events, but we've never really evaluated the community of practice to see if it meets our goals. And I think part of that is because the goals shift over time. Communities of practice do shift. That is a real thing. So yeah, I don't know like whether to recommend that a particular framework is the right one, or but having evaluation be part of the work, I think would be valuable. Heather?
Hi, thanks very much, Stephanie, for your presentation. I have a question that's kind of, I think, two parts, but related. So the first is whether or not the participants in your research project all were virtual communities of practice versus in-person communities of practice, which I think are sometimes more like setting or practice-based, where, you know, they all get together and share a pizza and have a community of practice over lunchtime. So that sort of is one part. And then second, did you have a sense around COVID and like your timeline of, I think you said they were all kind of like four or 5 years old, or a bunch of them, that they were moving into a community of practice because life changed and the organization of care and how we collaborate changed over COVID, and the communities of practice then became a thing that solved part of how life shifted. So kind of two questions mushed into one, please. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So no, it wasn't just virtual communities of practice. But they all we recruited through virtual means. So they all had websites and things. So that is one limitation of this study, is that if it wasn't publicly facing, we didn't hear about it and they weren't invited. So there was an amount of like resourcing where they could be advertised on a website somewhere. We conducted the interviews in summer 2020. So COVID was affecting all of these communities of practice full on. And and they were all moving virtual. So that while they didn't start off virtual, that was part of their like thinking when they were in these interviews, was like, how do we transition to Zoom-based meetings and that kind of thing. A lot of them were reporting that they were changing and this is one of the great things about communities of practice, is that they were saying, we are responding. We can kind of change our initial focus and we can help people in these different ways. And some were saying that community of practice basically was on hiatus during that early phase of COVID, and others were saying, we've never been busier, we're getting so many requests. So there was lots of different ways that people could and would respond. But yeah, it was interesting. If you're interested in virtual communities of practice, there is a paper that's about organizing virtual communities of practice specifically, that I can find the link to. But yeah, ours was for people all over the place. And they did kind of say like, yeah, the engagement methods that we listed, some are virtual and some are meant for in person. So that's one of those kind of factors that you want to think about if you're putting together a community of practices. How are we meeting and what does that mean for our different engagement methods? Yeah. Does that help? Okay. Michelle?
There early in the presentation, you showed a visual that had equity at the center, and I think you shared a little bit about how equity is embedded into the learning health systems. And I'm wondering if you can repeat that and expand on that a little bit. I just didn't have my notes going fast enough to capture what you said.
For sure. Let me pull up that visual. And how do I want to do this? Maybe I'll do this one. So this is called the quintuple aim. So it's a vision for healthcare around the goals that a lot of health systems follow. And so the quintuple aim, and I bring up this one rather than that big kind of flowery one, because the quintuple aim says that the 5 key goals of healthcare should be to improve patient experiences while they're there, improve provider experiences with these healthcare interactions, improve health outcomes, do so at a higher value, and do so in equitable ways. So they're kind of 5 distinct goals. They're related, but they're kind of distinct. There is a 6th one that's being proposed, that's being talked about more often, which is environmental impact should be part of this septuple aim. But I think one of the key things to think about when you're thinking about the quintuple aim is, are they that distinct? Or in this model's conceptualization, they actually say that everything should be driven by equity. If you focus on equity first, these other things will come along with it. So I do think that that's an interesting distinction. They don't say, this is Rob Reed and John Lavis, and they say, we don't really follow the quintuple aim. We say we're equity focused, and then when you're equity focused, it improves health outcomes, it improves experiences, and you can create better value. So it's just a kind of alternative way of looking at it. Does this help, Michelle?
Yes, I think you also mentioned earlier something about how there are certain segments of our population who might benefit from clinical change as it is, but we might not be reaching other people who either didn't inform those clinical changes or they're a step removed from being the direct recipients of those changes.
Yeah. So that's an issue of implementing through piloting and then scale and spreading versus implementing at scale, where inevitably if one group, and this is an issue too of what's the framework, where there's like laggards and then people will eventually come on. Evidence isn't taken up in a systematic way. Somebody will be inspired in some unit somewhere, and then you have like a pilot project somewhere, which means that people in that geography with that funding and resourcing who, for whatever reason, are attending that hospital will receive these benefits far before everybody else. So it's an argument towards implementation at scale. But we all know that implementation at scale is also like a risky thing to do. But this is an issue of equity, is like, okay, if we're not going to implement at scale, how do we prioritize which sites are the pilot sites? And are we doing it based on resources? Because those are probably the people with better health outcomes anyway. Or should we be piloting this in like rural, remote settings and seeing what happens? So yeah, that's where that argument comes from, is that learning health systems, one of the big things that they're trying to achieve is better equity in healthcare. And how do we come to terms with that? Sarah?
Great. Thanks, Stephanie, so much for such a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering, why communities of practice? Like, how did you land on that? And I think from an implementation perspective, I think about, identifying determinants of implementation and then matching those determinants to specific implementation strategies. And so I was just curious whether, there was some foundational work that was conducted to land on, communities of practice as a specific implementation strategy, or, was it solely based on sort of this prior experience? I guess just a bit interested in the history more.
Yeah.
To hear more about the history. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that is such a good question. I'm curious too. I kind of came on as those decisions had already been made. So I kind of came on, the community practice had just been launched, and then I became the manager of it. So I can't really say, but I suspect that it was actually more of an experiential thing. I know that Abs for You did a really in-depth oh yeah, I do know the answer to this. So this was ages ago. This was like back in 2017, 2018. So they did a big province-wide needs assessment around knowledge translation specifically. And so, and there is a paper about that too that I can pass along. I'm making notes about all these things that I'm going to share. But Abs4U did a developmental evaluation or formative evaluation to say, okay, what does our community need in terms of knowledge translation? And how can we best support the health system and researchers and patients that wanted to be involved in research activities? And they came up with a 4C model that had, that informed the way that Abs4U's knowledge translation team was set up. So they were set up to do consultations, contribute to the research. So that's where I got the green light to do this type of thing, was to contribute to knowledge translation evidence. A community of practice was another one that came out. I can never remember the 4C. But yeah, so it did come from a needs assessment. But just because people say they want a community of practice doesn't mean that it's linked to determinants of implementation and things, right? So I think that you're right in suspecting that this was more of a past experience type of thing. Reflecting on it, the Center for Implementation out of Toronto, they have a wonderful lean towards focusing on form and function. So not only looking at determinants, saying, okay, what's the actual function that we want a community of practice to play, and why are we choosing community of practice as that form? Is there something else that would serve that function better or worse? Or like, so there is thinking that you can do linked back to that intentionality of like, why are we choosing community of practice? Is this the right thing?
Exactly. Or, an implementation strategy that would address multiple barriers, and certainly the community of practice does, like it fits that bill. So yeah, great. No, that really great to hear your reflections. Thanks so much again.
Yeah,
really
no problem.
Thanks.
Vanessa.
I have another question. And kind of coming from Michelle's comment and question around the equity perspective and grounding, I'm wondering within your study, and if even just thinking within your experiences with communities of practice, what about looking at like communities of practice from that equity perspective? Did anything come up in your study around, whose voice is at the table, who's able to participate in this, even thinking about the virtual, the in-person, who's deciding on the goals and the priorities of the community of practice? Did any of that come up, or any reflections that you might have there?
Yeah, it didn't come up in our data. We didn't explicitly ask about it though. But it is interesting that nobody really brought it up either. I think that's one of those things in those different models that I shared, because there was knowledge exchange, knowledge sharing, mandatory community of practice, and interdisciplinary. So I think depending on which type of model you might follow, would tell you, does equity need to be central to your planning and launch of your community of practice? In learning health systems more generally, there is a real push to, it doesn't always work in practice, but there's a real push to, at minimum, have anybody who's impacted by a new change be part of that conceptualization group. So like they should have steering committees that have patients, frontline staff, intervention users, whatever, involved to say, yes, this improvement is needed, agree that the intervention that you choose on is the right direction. So there is some equity-based work there in terms of who should be setting learning priorities in learning health systems. But I think it's interesting about the community of practice, like the priority setting is more intuitive, but then when you're like, who's actually implementing, who needs the community of practice? How do we ensure that everybody who needs it has access? That's the equity issue. So yeah, it's a really good question, but we didn't really get far into that in our interviews.
Yeah, no, very fair. And yeah, now that is just making me think a little bit. So something to explore and reflect on. All right. Are there any additional questions? I mean, I can keep going. But are there any other questions that people have while we have the awesome Stephanie here with us today?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Michelle.
please, Michelle.
I don't want to hog the time, but I had another burning one, which was about the inclusion of patient perspectives and values, and if you came across specific methods or recommendations for ways to be able to do that. Like, are we looking at advisory boards, or are we looking at including people with lived experience as part of those communities of practice? Like, are there guidelines?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, so there is a patient engagement framework on the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research website, like the national website, so through CIHR. There's whole bodies of literature about engaging folks in health and research, as well as in learning health systems specifically. But I don't think that there's any real agreement, because patient engagement is something that changes as we learn more, right? And I think a big change that we're seeing is that, like, when SPORE was first initiated in 2011 and implemented in the next couple of years, it was really like patients should be involved in absolutely everything as deeply as we can possibly practically do it. And now we see how that risks tokenizing patients and users and all this kind of stuff. So it's like, now it's about thinking about who should be involved at what level, when. And one really nice resource that I like for this is from the Tamarack Institute. It's called the Involvement Scale. And they have, like, I think that their guidance is like hang on. So, and that would be for thinking through including everybody, it's not patient based, but like for any users that you want to engage with. How do you decide which level makes sense for yours? How do you invite them? How do you take their input with grace? So I think that that's a really nice resource from the Tamarack Institute that might help you. Yeah.
Awesome. I don't think I've seen that one. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, similar question to Michelle. Are you aware of any patient communities of practice in the LHS context? Like, I can imagine that would be a great forum for for training, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is such a good question. Like, I know that there's they wouldn't call themselves they'd call themselves support groups or things like that, where like patients with a similar condition get together to share experiences about how to manage what's going on with them. But I don't know if there's any like spaces where patients are invited to talk about their experience as advisors or in research as research partners, things like that. I think that that would be a really interesting means, but I think it would still need to be facilitated to say, like, to help them talk about their experiences in ways that we can use to improve how we engage different people. So I think that's a really interesting point, but I'm not familiar with any groups like that.
Good to know. And just, I guess, a follow-up. Sorry, I missed this, but did you have people with lived experience as part of your community of practice?
No, ours didn't. Ours was really built from a steering committee of knowledge translation experts across Alberta. But that's who the community of practice was really geared towards. We weren't at the time. This is making me reflect on the types of activities we even considered. I don't even know that we considered patient-oriented or patient directed activities in terms of knowledge translation. Certainly if you were going to have a community of practice, because ours was really about like knowledge translation, getting knowledge translation specialists together talking. But if I was going to develop a community of practice in a health system around a program that's being implemented, community and family and patients' perspectives would be super helpful to learn what's going right and what's going wrong. So again, I think really thinking through, why are you developing your community of practice? who is it serving? Maybe having membership from patients would make sense. Maybe it would make more sense for them to just come and present, or to have some type of feedback tool so that they wouldn't have to attend, but they could kind of contribute. Who knows? But yeah, I think having that intentionality will help.
Great. Thanks so much, Ken.
Thank you. Andrea?
I was just actually going to follow up on Sarah's question that we're launching a community of practice for the family engagement research course grads, and that's come out of a request from families and researchers. So we're launching that this year. But we've had families attend our efforts community of practice for the last 2 years. And so that has families, researchers, and healthcare professionals who are all interested. And it's really lovely having all those different perspectives, and people take turns sharing and presenting. Vanessa is our leader there as well. But that's been really helpful. We also got funding at McMaster to start a community of practice in patient and family engagement and research. And families were attending that. And actually, we're getting more families attending than we were researchers. The challenge that I came up against was the funding for that. And so that has been a barrier because of limited funding, right? So we're still exploring that further. And Stephanie, they did something similar to what you talked about. It was the Department of Medicine, and they launched like 7 communities of practice. And then they had a leadership community of practice. And the whole responsibility of that leadership community of practice was to like help support all the communities of practice and bring us together and facilitate. And that was a really positive learning experience.
Love that. I love to hear from because that's another limitation of this study, is we didn't ask the organization or the users about their experiences with the communities of practice. We just talked about to the facilitators. So hearing how valuable that facilitation platform was for you is fantastic. I love to hear that.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I just want to thank you again, Stephanie, for taking the time to come and share your knowledge and your experiences. And you can see from the chat how much everyone gained from this presentation and learned. So thank you so much. And congratulations again on your successful PhD defense. So exciting for you. And thank you everyone for taking the time to be here today. This community would not be what it is without all of you. So we really appreciate that. Again, plug for the feedback survey. We will share that also after the session, along with any resources that Stephanie has, and the recording. And the recording will also be on the KBHN website. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Stephanie, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all. Thank you, Stephanie.
Bye.